I am so excited about this panel on government and effectively government transparency in the cloud. This is something that when we were sitting around and planning the conference, we'd sort of been thinking about ways this might come up in other panels or other contexts, and what just became increasingly clear to us and then just sort of struck us forcefully was that this is really one of the most important ways that these general principles about privacy and transparency and things like that are actually making themselves felt. And so we woke up late in the game, but not too late, and said this is something we really need to do. And we had, I think, very fortunate breaks as we began to reach out and look for some of the key people in the field to come and share their views with us. And we have 3 of them up here today, and I'm so excited to hear from them. So I'll stop and let them start, beginning with a friend of mine and a person whose work I greatly admire. He started GovTrack, what, 3 years ago?
4 or 5.
4 or 5 years ago.
Not sure anymore.
So this is someone who I knew as a classmate, as an undergraduate at Princeton, and who took it really upon himself to help to bring about something that's becoming at this point a much larger and as our presence here now reflects a much better known trend. So with that, I'll turn it over to Josh Tauberer.
Thanks, David. Hang on. That's unexpected. Okay. Thanks, David. Thanks a lot for inviting me here today. I have some visual aids, so I'm excited about that. This panel, Civics in the Cloud, is, I think, aptly named for the 3 of us up here. It could have been named Politics in the Cloud. Then you might have expected to hear about how blogs, the long tail, and social networking are transforming electoral politics, campaigns, a hot topic. But while campaigns are about getting people into the government, civics seems to be more about the relationship between citizens and the government itself, and that's the focus for us, using the cloud to illuminate and strengthen the relationship between citizens and the government. And I realized yesterday that when looking at things from this perspective, the cloud seems to turn things around. So it helps make the government less private, which is a nice thing. And it makes the government maybe more robust, not to malware, but maybe mal policy or something like that. So, so it's an interesting reversal, an inversion of control or something. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. First, one way that computing today is helping to expand the relationship between citizens and the U.S. Congress by providing new views into the government. Second, what kind of policy decisions should be made so technology can do more. And third, where I hope technology will go in the future with respect to making the cloud an integral part of civics. So the public's primary internet source for the status of pending federal legislation has been, since 1995, a website named Thomas, run by the Library of Congress. The site today is so important because Congress does far more than the mainstream media covers or could cover, and if it weren't for Thomas, the public could hardly learn about most legislative events. Between 5,000 and 10,000 bills are introduced each year, and Congress only gets busier from year to year. So with so much happening in Congress, we need computers to sort, search, and transform the information into manageable chunks for us humans. A few things happened to pique my interest in civics and technology around 7 years ago that eventually led me to create GovTrack. And since this is my first return to Princeton in an academic capacity, I think I can take a moment to talk about how GovTrack began. So it all began a little bit after I took a class here as an undergraduate on the intersection of free speech, copyright law, and technology taught by Professor Andrew Appel, who was here yesterday and might be here today. There he is. So as we were learning about the problem of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the seemingly unnecessary power Congress had given to digital content publishers, a story was simultaneously unfolding of Ed Felton's watermark research getting him stuck between a rock, the recording industry, and a hard place, which was the law. So the curious IT policy Congress had enacted made me intrigued by how little politicians are kept responsible to their constituents. I wanted to see how the internet could spread information to bridge the citizen-congressman divide. So eventually, all of this came govtrack.us, important because someone grabbed .com shortly after, and regrettably I didn't think to buy that one too, which went live in 2004. GovTrack is a tool that you can use to track what's happening in Congress. It collects information automatically from government websites, like Thomas, and represents it in a number of new ways. On the one hand, GovTrack can be used as a research tool. One can search for and browse bills, much like Thomas. Some other highlights of the site are color coding of bill text to show how a bill has been amended on its way to becoming law, which impressively shows up on this projector. So there's like color coding for inserted text and deleted text. A Google Maps mashup to help you find your congressional district. And there's also some novel statistical analyses. So the map here shows the political leanings of each congressman as based on a statistical analysis of bill sponsorship patterns. The intensity kind of shows the political leanings. On the site, you can also track subjects, representatives, and bills and get customized RSS feeds and email updates that are relevant to your interests. So this brings us back to our need for computers to transform information so we can see the same data from different perspectives, so we can understand it better. And for the data about the government, it is especially important that the public be able to transform that data and not rely on the few presentations of the data that the government has the resources, mandate, or desire to create. GovTrack is, of course, just the beginning of what can be done with legislative information. Once you have a database of this information, there's no end to what you can do. Well, almost. So sometimes databases can't quite capture reality because sometimes we're not really sure what reality is. And not just like me as website creator not knowing what reality is, but sometimes Congress and the whole government doesn't know what the reality is. So it happens more often than one would like, and it's happening now. So the Constitution defines how a bill can become a law. It outlines a finite state machine. This is perhaps one way of doing that, but it's kind of a parody. I don't know if you can see it. Let's see. Sometimes it's not clear when a transition has been made from one state to the next. So there's a bit of a debacle over the defense spending bill, which President Bush claimed he pocket vetoed in December. A pocket veto occurs when Congress is adjourned and the president neither signs nor vetoes a bill. In that case, Congress doesn't get the opportunity to try and override the bill because Congress is adjourned, and so they're not around to try and override it. And the president knew that in this case the bill was likely to be overridden, and so he did what he had to do and tried to pocket veto it to avoid the override. So in this diagram, what the president thinks he did was number 3 in the red box at the bottom. So Congress is adjourned, and he thinks he pocket vetoed it. Let's see. So on the other hand, congressional leaders claim they were just on a little break, but not actually adjourned, whatever the difference might be. And so they think no pocket veto could possibly have occurred. They would view the situation differently, that the bill is not dead, but still awaiting either the signature of the president or a veto, which the president, has to do according to the Constitution. So they think the president has taken no action, which is still box 3, except that the Constitution says that there's a time limit here. If 10 days go by and the president hasn't signed the bill or vetoed it, it becomes law by default. So that's the green box going the other way. To make matters worse, the president tried to cover all the bases by simultaneously going through some of the motions of a normal veto. And so there are actually 3 states that the bill might be in right now, either dead due to the pocket veto, enacted into law by default, or vetoed but awaiting an override. And so we just don't know actually what the state of the world is. It's kind of sad. And we won't know if it's law or not, right? Things could change, but okay. Nuanced situations like this are hard to capture in data. It's one reason why the Congress is hesitant to publish raw data on its own, for fear of both publishing inaccurate information when it can't capture the nuances, and publishing information in a way that it loses control over who can actually address those nuances and comment on it. And it's still an open question about how to responsibly present data that has nuanced information. But that doesn't stop us from building databases anyway. So other sites that use a legislative database include maplight.org that Andrew's going to talk about, opencongress.org, whereabill.org, themiddleclass.org, lots of .orgs. These sites use the same legislative database that I assembled for GovTrack, and that's because while the Library of Congress has a comprehensive database of legislative information, it's the one that powers Thomas, it doesn't make that database available to the public in any machine processable way, like XML, leaving sites like mine having to so-called screen scrape the HTML pages of their website to reconstruct the underlying data. Screen scraping is a delicate process and difficult to make comprehensive. It's really just a hack, not a long-term solution. Machine processable data, structured data, is not a new concept in the government, but it is often resisted and rarely made a priority. Some arms of the government have embraced it. The Census Bureau, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Election Commission all make their gigabytes and gigabytes of information available not only on a website, but also as a download in a machine processable format, and have done so for many years. 6 state legislatures publish their status of legislation in a structured data format. But while the Web Services team at the Library of Congress knows how useful a public database of their legislative information would be to the public, they had, last I checked, no plans to actually make their database available. On the other hand, the House of Representatives is actually making some good progress with XML. They publish roll call votes and the text of most bills in XML. Putting votes in XML makes it easier for sites like the New York Times, as well as GovTrack, to create new visual representations of the outcomes of votes. These are really cool if you haven't seen them on the New York Times website yet. But on the other hand, the House's motivation for releasing the XML documents that they're creating has primarily been to improve their own internal workflow. They haven't really had us in mind when they share their information. The Senate is catching up. They currently make no information publicly available using a structured data format. Besides the text of legislation and votes, there's the membership of committees. That's something that they have in XML, but they simply don't share it as a matter of policy. But the future is bright. At the December 11th hearing of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, Senator Lieberman, the chair of the committee, noted that Senate votes are intentionally presented in a format that limits the public's ability to examine senators' voting records, by which a staffer later told me that he meant that the Senate should just use XML like the House does to publish their votes to the public, in addition to what they do now. So it's kind of neat that this suggestion got to the senators' attention through the work that John Wonderlich and I and others have done through the Open House project. One of the problems with opening government data, especially in the Congress, is that goals for the use of technology are not being set. In the Open House project, which John helped start, and which is a project of the Sunlight Foundation, and which I think he's going to talk about, we outlined attainable technological goals for the House of Representatives, some of which I've mentioned here. Last month, separately, an Open Government Working Group conference also developed a set of 8 principles for what it means for government data to be open. Some of the principles say that data must be made available in a non-proprietary, machine-processable format, made available in a timely manner, and without special restrictions on its use, like copyright. We offered the principles both as a benchmark and also as policy recommendations. And those are the websites for those 2 projects. So things are on the up and up for open government data. We're getting more and more data that Congress already has opened up in XML, and it is being put to use. But I hope that XML is not the end game for government information. XML is a data format that here happens to facilitate proper standardization and normalization. XML is good for building a database. It is not good for meshing databases. So corruption was once long, long ago a hot topic, and long ago being about a year ago, but we've probably already forgotten that. Who was taking money from who? Where were they giving it back in earmarks? And were representatives voting with money in mind? To answer these questions comprehensively, 3 separate data sources are required: campaign contribution data, earmark data, and voting records. Databases exist for all of this information, but these databases don't talk to each other. They have no columns in common to establish connections from records in one database to records in another. The direction I would like to see our civics data community take is toward using the standards that make up the semantic web. The semantic web seems to be something that either you think is a hopeless dream of an early internet pioneer, or else you haven't heard of it yet. But I think it does have a lot of practical value for civics. The semantic web is a bit like, it's a lot like today's web. Today's web is made up of pages connected together by hyperlinks. Pages are something meant to be displayed by a web browser, and it's for the immediate benefit of a human looking at pretty HTML and Flash. It's really a web of presentations. The semantic web is a layer on top of the existing web whose target audience is computers, not humans. It's a web of data, and the point is to allow computers to help us process the information or the knowledge that's on the web. For instance, Wikipedia contains a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, but computers can't really process the information and make any sense of it. All they can do is present it on screen. A semantic web Wikipedia, which is being tried in sort of an academic sense, would publish some of the same information, but in a format that computers could manipulate, possibly answer questions about, though not understand in any deep sense, obviously. On the semantic web, websites publish databases in a common format called RDF, in such a way that records in one database can be tied to records in databases from other sources, if a certain amount of planning is done. So it's always in the details of the planning, but the standards that make up the semantic web facilitate this goal. The benefit to civics is that we can start to ask new and more complex questions about our government, questions that span data sets that we couldn't do before without a lot of hard work. I've converted legislative, campaign finance, and census data into RDF, which means I can write queries in an SQL-like language that cover all of the data sets at once. How much money did lawyers contribute to representatives who voted for or against some particular bill? That query uses the two sources highlighted above. Did Rush Holt, Princeton's representative, receive more campaign contributions per capita from the zip code here or from little noticed sources elsewhere in the country? So that type of query requires all three data sources. And it's not that these questions can't be answered today, but today's solution would be to create a new ad hoc database or program each time a new question arises. Using RDF, we make a trade-off, a little bit more work in the beginning to create a cloud of data. The cloud is back. But the benefit of making each new query becomes extremely easy to execute. Some new questions lend themselves to new visualizations. The map I'm showing colors each congressional district in this area in red or blue according to the usual party affiliation, but the intensity, which might be viewable, is what? I forget what I put up there. Is the median income in each congressional district. And you can imagine that there might be some policy debate in which this is important. So there's bright red in northern New Jersey and for lots of income, and dark blue around Philadelphia for not so good income. Okay. As more interlinked data gets into RDF, the possibilities for meshing data together grow rapidly, which means questions about our government involving a lot of data become easier to answer. And that's the exciting thing that the cloud is doing for civics. It makes it easier to create new transformations of data, revealing new insights into what our government is doing, possibly exposing corruption if we're lucky, and in turn making the government more responsible to us citizens. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. So one of the things that Josh was saying, that when you get the data into a machine-readable format, it then becomes possible for anyone else who wants to come along and build tools on top of the data and put it to new uses or new combinations of uses. Our next speaker, our next speaker is going to give us insight into, I think, one of the most exciting examples of a specific way in which the data that Josh has published has
Along with other data.
Has been able to be put to use. So I will here are we
just think like that.
all right, so with that, Andrew Page, the Associate Director of Maplife.org.
Hi, and it's pretty exciting for me to be here. I'm more of a neophyte to the cloud in general, so it's been really educational and a a privilege. What I want to do, and thank you to Ed and David and Laura as well, and Microsoft for making this whole thing possible. I want to look at, sort of turn around and look at the audience. When it comes to civic engagement, it's a different sort of audience, I think, than has been typically engaging with the data. Academics or people who are driven by their own interests or corporate interests to start engaging in data this way have different motivators. And people who are doing civic engagement at the grassroots level, et cetera, they have less time, they have less resources, et cetera, often to start using this data. So we've spent a lot of time taking the information that is available and thinking about how to make it more usable. When I say audience, I have three particular audiences in mind: journalists, advocacy groups, and then bloggers and other civic leaders who are sort of ahead of the curve in terms of educating themselves and getting the information out there. And the characteristics specifically of cloud computing that I think help take this information and present it that are really crucial are one, the nature of the data, two, the timeliness of it, and then three, the ability to take that data and manipulate it in ways that are immediately useful for the ends of those particular groups, whether it's advocacy or journalists trying to cover a particular issue. So the slides I'm going to show later are about the third one of those. But first, what MapLight does... Oh, before I get into that, I want to tell a quick story. Back in May 7th, Senator Thad Cochran introduced an amendment to the prescription drug user fee amendments in 2007. It's a legislation to cover drug user fees. His amendment effectively maintained a ban on buying cheap pharmaceuticals from abroad. Starting from May 9th in the reporting period after that, he received $16,500 in contributions from pharmaceutical manufacturers. Now, even a year ago, getting that hunk of data, that story, would have taken quite a lot of work, quite a lot of going through and putting records together. Certainly 5 years ago, it would have been hours and hours. And now, within an hour, if a story like that exists in the data, within an hour, somebody can go in and find those correlations between money and votes. And it's an extraordinary change in access to this very powerful data. What MapLight does specifically is we bring the money aspect of it and the politics together. I'm going to need this in a minute. We get the money data, and we do this at the federal level and also at the state level. So we get the money from the Center for Responsive Politics, opensecrets.org, and we combine this with, as you now know, from GovTrack US, from Josh's work, the legislative information from the Library of Congress. At the state level, we work with the National Institute for Money and State Politics, and we scrape data basically from a whole host of state government websites, or not a whole host. Right now we have just California data, and we're working to expand that to cover other states as well. And one aspect when we get to talking about this is the difference going on at the state level, presenting this information from what's happening at the federal level. When you combine these bits of information, the part that we provide is right here in the middle, which is another data set that takes the information, the support and opposition information of the industries. So specifically the companies that lobby and provide the campaign information, how they lobby on the different legislation that the legislators are voting on. And that's what we use to knit together the information and create something that's much greater than the sum of its parts. When you look at this data, you can look at it from three angles. You can look at the interest group, and you can see how, for instance, how often they succeed at, whether they get their money, basically. If they're putting money into a campaign, how often that actually pays off and they get legislation going their way. You can look at it from a legislator point of view. see all the top 10 industries that fund them. A lot of that information has been available already. And then you can also look at it from the legislation point of view and see how the money plays out on either side of any particular vote. So, and you can do this now across all legislation, all legislators, and all the interest groups that are out there. So it's a huge amount of information that is really begging to be studied. And any political scientists out there who are interested in starting looking at this, please get in touch with me. So that, just the nature of that itself is very important. And probably, the fundamental thing that we're looking at as exciting in terms of going forward in civic engagement is that this is information that just was not available to people. The other aspect is when it's available. So if you think of that story I just told you about Thad Cochran, you hear it now, and it's, the response is, yeah, that's the game. That's how it's played. It's not a surprise. I know that already. But if you've gotten that information, maybe between the time that the amendment was voted on and the floor vote, or other information about correlations coming in and how money is impacting the way the discussion, the nature of the debate, or how it's being resolved, getting the information at that time is a really different, there's a really different reaction to it, a different relationship to it, and puts you in much more in a position of power to do something about it and engage it. For a journalist, it's current news. It's much more newsworthy to put it into a story. So being able to do this stuff on the fly as it happens, Josh has sped up the amount of times he's pinging the sites and getting the information from the Senate and House committees so that we can report within an hour after the vote. We can start knitting these bits of data together. Getting that information out that quickly is hugely important to our audience. And then finally, being able to really engage with the data and get the information you want out of it is something that's really revolutionary and new in this data set. So I just want to have a few slides about how people can go to our database and get the information out. This is a picture from maplight.org that shows the contributions. So these are leading up to the vote, and here's the May 7th vote there, and that spike there is contributions from the pharmaceutical industry right after that amendment was voted on and after the final vote. So it's a pretty compelling graph there. But if you come to maplight.org site and you type in S1082, which is the bill, where you first get to is the page that shows what we supply, which is the supporters and opponents of the bill. In this case, actually, there weren't any opponents to the amendment, so we just have the supporters over here. That's in most cases or in a lot of cases, there are people on both sides of these, and people who support the bill are in green, people who oppose it are in red. And then you click on this tab here, and you get this bar graph that shows the average contribution from, in this case, the aggregated supporters of the bill, how much they gave to people who voted yes, and how much they gave to legislators who voted no. Now, to get toward that information that somebody's specifically interested in, this is a relatively new feature where you can use this drop-down menu, and you can choose which one of the single interests that you want to look at. And here's the chart for pharmaceuticals, and the bars looks the same, but it's 100,000 here for people who support it, and 38,000 for people who are against it. Then you can use this feature, the timeline of contributions, and this shows how much the pharmaceuticals gave to everybody who voted on that legislation in the couple of years leading up to it. And then you can further refine that. This is everybody who had an opportunity to vote on the legislation, and here we've chosen Cochran, and this is the actual chart that I used in the beginning there that shows the contributions to him. And finally, and this is in terms of the integrity of the data, a very important aspect as well, is you can click on any one of these bars and you get the specific FEC data of what those contributions are, where they came from, where they went to, when they were voted. So that's a rush through of one aspect of being able to go into how it's presented in a way that's compelling in the beginning, but also invites people to really start going into it and thinking of different ways of getting out information that's going to be useful to them. We have other features that you can customize. If you know something that we haven't coded in there, you can actually go in there and say, I happen to know that this industry supports it. And we put a little banner saying that this is user-created information. And we're trying to build ways of getting correlations between money and the legislative process even before the votes happen. That's a little trickier because the vote is key for us, but looking at what's happening in committees, et cetera. We've also introduced a couple of widgets, and I'm sure everyone here knows what a widget is, but this one is we launched in August. We're just launching, that's our presidential fundraising widget or presidential money race widget. We're launching our congressional money race widget tomorrow, I think, or maybe Thursday. And this, I'm showing this because it also gets at where we're coming from. All this data, just as Josh has taken his data and presented it in XML for everybody, we've done the same thing with this FEC data when we did this. We're not just providing the widget that people can come and customize. You see this lovely teal example if you have a teal website, you can make it fit in that way. And these are some people using the various widgets. But we've also provided the tools to customize. We've provided the APIs, and so people can get the data directly any way they want. And we've also provided the source code for creating this widget. And I'll tell you, it was, especially the congressional money race widget, was a bear to make. The different programming tools are giving it the flexibility to be in any sort of situation was tough. I saw as a third party anyway. It took a lot longer than we thought it was going to. And finally, so those are just some of the tools that we're using and providing to people. We are a nonprofit, and we're always looking for folks to help. We also have some more information if people want to grab more information about the organization in general. I've got it back on the table there. Some of the ways people can really help us out a lot is people who don't have PHP background. We're working to get into all 50 states. We want to provide this for every state legislature, and yet the data is an incredible, a lot of it's not very accessible, some of it is. So anybody who has a PHP programming background and wants to adopt a state, we've got a few states in the works that we're scraping the information and making it presentable. And we need more. We need 50, or 48, I guess, at this point. We're also looking for people who might be able to help us out with sentiment analysis, web crawlers that can then take some of the information about support and opposition data that's out there and feed it to us so that we can have information for the website. And then finally, anybody with political science background who wants to look at this unprecedented data set, we're looking for people to help us out that way. And any third-party analysis of what we really have would be hugely helpful. And so that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So you've heard today so far about how the effort to get cooperation on the Hill from the people who are ultimately generating much of the data that people care about trying to analyze and measure is very important. And our third speaker is a leader in that effort, John Wonderlich, who is a program director at the Sunlight Foundation. John.
Thank you, David. Is this on? Is this working? Okay. First, I want to say I'm delighted to be here, and it's very enjoyable for me to be on a panel with Josh. We were talking about how one of our first panels that we both spoke on was actually in the Capitol building, and so they've all basically gotten easier since then. And I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be involved in all this, because it's sort of emblematic of a lot of the other things that we're trying to talk about. A little over a year ago, I was a sales manager at a telemarketing company in Pennsylvania. And right after the 2006 election, I was writing on Daily Kos, which is the liberal blog that's come up repeatedly, probably not a surprise, but come up repeatedly throughout these panels. And after the election, I started a group of people, and the goal was to try to break into groups and watch congressional committees. And I had no idea what I was getting into. Right after suggesting it, I got hundreds and hundreds of emails. Every day I got hundreds, literally hundreds of emails that I had to sort through from people that were saying, I'd really like to do this. I am a professor of blank thing, and I want to start following blank committee because I really know the substance of that legislation. So we broke up into small groups, or organized ourselves on a wiki. I didn't even know how to edit a wiki at the time. And then from there, almost immediately, everybody's question was, how do you follow what happens in a congressional committee? I hadn't really thought about that yet, so it became my job at that point from this ad hoc group to sort of be in charge of how is it possible to pay attention to Congress. So one of the first things that I wrote about was, is it required that congressional committees publish their transcripts? And the answer was basically, committees are supposed to publish things as much as is possible, and they're supposed to put things online as much as is possible. And when you combine those two things, it was 2006 at the time. The most recent transcripts, for the most part, were from 2003. So in practice, it wasn't really being done at all, and you couldn't effectively watch what was happening in congressional committees. From there, I guess very luckily, one of Nancy Pelosi's that had just been voted in as the incoming speaker, one of her staff members read what I wrote and said, we're starting to think about governance rather than elections since we just won and we weren't really sure that was going to happen. We want to think about how much we're going to change now that we're going to start to make adjustments in the House rules. Because the last time the Democrats were in the majority was 1994 when the internet was a very different thing. So from there, the goal was to put together a list of recommendations for Congress, or specifically for the House at that time, on what they could do, sort of attainable incremental changes that they could undertake to give people access to Congress. So I got hooked up with the Sunlight Foundation, and we organized this project and found all these really smart, intelligent people with so much knowledge of the substance of Congress who are former staff members or current staff members in Congress, or people like Josh who were just undergraduates in college and built a system for displaying bills that's better than the Library of Congress system. If you think about it, it's kind of amazing. Even now I use his site rather than going to the Library of Congress because you can link to a bill and it's an enduring link. And if you link to a Library of Congress bill, it expires, and you get a thing that says, sorry, your search has expired. So, I mean, even after 5 years, his site is still working better than the Library of Congress one. So it's really exciting to work with everybody. I'm sorry. I just find it to be a really exciting story. Anyway, so we organized the Open House Project, right? And the idea of that was to get people to collaborate publicly online and talk about what Congress could do to open access to information. And there were a couple of hundred people that signed up for the bulk of the work happened through a Google group, and it's all archived and public, so you can see all the conversations that led us to break into sort of smaller working groups around specific topics. Over the next several months, this sort of became my dark second life. In the evening, I would research Congress and blog all night. We broke into specific groups around things and ended up coming out with a report in May of 2007 that said, here are the specific things we'd like to see Congress do differently so that people can meaningfully engage with Congress online. And that's when I actually moved to D.C. and started working for the Sunlight Foundation. So it's sort of like blogging led me to be involved in this. So briefly, what we found out about Congress, just to give you a sense of what it is that we're dealing with. One of the first things that became obvious dealing with Josh, who also was very heavily involved and helped produce the report, was giving access to raw data. So instead of having to scrape the Library of Congress every day and all these other sites, trying to create a place where the public can access the raw data behind the legislation. Because they have it, they just don't let people access it. And I know that they're working on that. Another thing that came up is preserving foreign digital information. So as everything moves online and bills are drafted online and press releases, they maybe exist only in the congressional press galleries, but otherwise they don't exist. As things move online, our ability to preserve them that's probably the last thing people think about, but these are obviously important historical documents. So we wanted to address that in a sort of codified manner. Congressional committees, there's not even a place to go to if you want to see what House committees, what meetings are coming up. You have to go to every individual committee. So we're trying to address that and have them either publish that information in a structured data format so that it can be aggregated, or to have at least somebody in the House be responsible for it. But that's tough because in this sort of political institution environment, everybody operates within their own sort of negotiated jurisdiction. And so if nobody's explicitly in charge of it, they're only going to become in charge of it either because they have an interest to, or because you have appropriated them money and told them that they're in charge of it. So adding something to someone's jurisdiction is always challenging. I don't know if I should go through all the sections, but we also address Congressional Research Service reports, which are not public. That's basically Congress's research arm, and it would almost be okay if they weren't public, except that somehow private companies have access to all of them and then sell them. So this is congressional research that's funded with taxpayer money that's then being sold by other services for $75 a report. So that's kind of disgusting. The Sunlight Foundation is working with the Center for Democracy and Technology to address this. There's a site called OpenCRS, and if you're ever researching something on Congress, that's a great place to start, is to search OpenCRS and see if there's any reports about it, because it's written for members of Congress, but it's very accessible information. I won't go through all the sections because I obviously will start talking about them in detail, but one more that's just an interesting example of what we're dealing with. If you're a member of Congress, or more likely their staff member that's designing your website, which is paid for with out of what's called the Member Representational Allowance, which is their sort of budget for their office, because all members of Congress sort of operate as small businesses. If you want to design a website, you have to be aware that there's all sorts of restrictions about what can be done on your website. And this is done under the jurisdiction of the Franking Commission. Now, the frank or franking is the privilege of members of Congress to send mail for free, which sort of makes sense as a government business, and to some degree, it makes sense that a member of Congress can send free mail. But what's funny is that the board that's responsible for deciding whether or not things are electoral or political, and the people that say, oh, this is a campaign mailer, you can't get this sent for free, they're the same ones who deal with the website restrictions. So basically when websites started to exist in the 90s for members of Congress, they said, well, who's going to be responsible for enforcing this? We'll just treat it as mail. So basically Congress treats websites as the same thing as mass mailings, which leaves you with all sorts of arcane restrictions. Basically you can't use any tool that has any sort of branding on it because it might imply an endorsement. And you can't, there's all sorts of restrictions that make them unable to function. So there's a bunch of other things with the Open House Project, other recommendations. So from there, after going there and kind of announcing this report, I started working for the Sunlight Foundation. And just to back up a little bit and give you a sense of what the Sunlight Foundation does, the sort of operating principle behind the Sunlight Foundation is that transparency in government, specifically in the legislature, is absolutely necessary, and it's the main vehicle that we can have to have trust in the government and to promote accountability. So that when the way that incentives are supposed to work within the legislature is that if somebody does a poor job, you vote them out, right? But that only works if you can make a real evaluation of what they're doing. And that only can happen if you have access to information about what they're doing. And sort of at the core of that for the Sunlight Foundation is the belief that the internet is going to play a really central role in redesigning and reigniting that trust in government. And so it's exciting to me to be involved in that, sort of at this place that's working between all the people that are using this information in compelling ways and the people in the government that want to see it happen but have a hard time operating within the power structures that they're in. So it's been particularly exciting sort of working with this blog and this listserv, and also being to some degree a registered lobbyist now, which is very odd for me to say, to have people approach me from the executive branch or from any different administrative places in Congress and to say, I have this piece of information that's extremely valuable, or I have this reporting of these certain kinds of events, and they aren't public, but they should be. Or they are public, but the structured data that's behind it isn't public, and I'd really like to see that be available, but I can't lobby Congress because I'm an employee. I can't tell my bosses because they don't particularly care. So what's happened is that we've become an external power structure outside of Congress where people can sort of advocate for things in an open way. It's sort of like open lobbying. the way that interest groups are supposed to work, but they don't really work that way. So some of the effects of having these sort of open power structures and open information about Congress, it realigns motivations. Like I was saying, the electoral incentive is kind of insufficient when it's so easy to just look at the presidential campaigns. It's based on image. It's not based on, it's such a hot topic, like you were saying before. Incentives are supposed to be designed for politicians because a good vote or a good bill or good policy should stand on its own merit. But that's obviously not what happens. It's more about marketing and holding up your own party and all these things that aren't there. So the better voters have access to real information and real ways to evaluate things, the better the motivations are aligned in Congress. So that would be sort of the public having an oversight role of Congress. The other thing that it does when you have these sort of open power structures is that people in the public can play a policy-oriented role. So all the expertise, this is sort of how I got involved in everything, all the expertise that's distributed around the country about whatever policy issue, Congress can't really take advantage of that. They're ridiculously busy, even though they tend to have 30 or 40 staff members. If there's going to be a hearing on whatever issue it is, there's no easy vehicle for them to just turn and say, okay, who are the experts and how can you talk to me about it? Congressional hearings tend to be for show. They're to get support behind something. It's not necessarily to say what's the best answer. So that's the other thing it does. When you have all this information about what's happening in Congress, the expertise of experts around the country actually gets connected to policy and substance. So moving forward from there, some questions or things I'd like to raise is that there's going to be a lot more development around what it means to collaborate in a truly public sense that's civically relevant. So, as you can see with what they're working on, what it means to be civically empowered or civically involved is totally being reinvented, and that's going to continue to be reinvented. And that's a very, very good thing, but it also means that we have to rethink what it means to be involved with your government. And it also has, to me, almost completely positive effects. I recently wrote about this. I was reading somebody from Berkeley, Paul Pearson, wrote a book about Politics and Time, it's called, and he describes 4 different ways that political institutions are self-reinforcing structures. He calls this path dependence, but you could call it the advantage of the first mover or a positive feedback loop. So political structures tend to regenerate their own power. And the 4 ways that he describes this as happening, to me, the internet and what we're working on is a mitigating factor against all of them. So one of the ways that politics reinforces itself is that it's inscrutable. And this is what, if you look at Josh's diagram with Congress being ridiculous, or when Andrew was talking about all the data that nobody could get to, well, it was public, but it was completely inscrutable. Nobody could access it. And that's one of the ways that Congress, or whatever political power structure, tends to reinforce itself. The internet is making those things much more scrutable with things like Wikipedia or GovTrack, or even Thomas in 1995 when Gingrich created the way to post legislation. They're all generating, making it easier to engage with legislation. So to me, those mechanisms that are promoting scrutability are only starting to develop. So that's being pushed back against. I don't want to get into all of them, but all the different ways that he talks about politics as being a self-reinforcing structure are pushed back against by people engaging online. And the last thing I'd like to say, because I could talk about this forever, is that Congress has gone through a lot of serious changes before. And it's kind of overwhelming to think about everybody having access to all data and what's going to happen. And there are concerns about what if everybody has video cameras all the time, and can they even be good faith actors. And sometimes when you make people report their earmarks, it becomes a bragging right rather than keeping them from doing it, or like lobbying disclosure. Sometimes you just get to see who the really good lobbyists are, and it has unintended consequences. But I think it's important also to remember that a lot of these things have happened before, and even if you look back at history, when different technology is introduced, it has a big impact on things. Even if you look at stenography, it didn't exist when Congress first started, and there was no congressional record. So if you look at the very first, I think it's called the Congressional Globe, because the Globe newspaper was responsible for the records. And it's nothing but partisan musings on what's happening, and you can't even see what was said in the first few Congresses. And then when stenography was introduced, suddenly you can see what's said because people were able to sit there and write fast enough to keep up with it. So there are all those technological changes like C-SPAN that came along that end up enabling other structural changes that have a huge impact. So I think we're at a really unique time to say that the internet is developing really quickly, and it can have huge structural process implications about the way things are organized in the society, and it will probably also have immense policy implications too. So.
Thanks, John. Questions? I'll start with one. I have noticed as I've gotten to know the group here a little bit that is involved and in Washington is involved in this sort of transparency effort, that most of the key movers and shakers come from the left politically. And the way that I first noticed this was that last year I was working at the American Enterprise Institute, a right-leaning think tank, helping them publish an online magazine, and was sort of surprised that the view that they had of issues of this kind was that all these efforts to have everything published online was sort of a left-wing thing. And I think part of it originated perhaps with the Howard Dean campaign experience, which left a lot of people feeling like use of the internet was something that was a comparative advantage in general for the left. And so I sort of wonder whether this is an obstacle for efforts to get things to be more open. And I also wonder now that Republicans are in the minority in Congress, and have sort of had to back away from sort of the attitudes that majorities have the luxury of having, and are now pressing for more transparency, whether there's any contrary pressure building.
I've definitely got some thoughts on that. I think traditionally transparency advocacy tends to be a minority party issue because whoever is in the majority has an interest in keeping what they're doing secret. So you can see that in whenever the majority changes hands in Congress, whoever goes in the minority starts saying whatever the majority was saying before. It's kind of, they just reverse roles. There has been a lot of significant reform since the Democrats regained control. And with S1 in particular and other things that were major. But at the same time, there are a great deal of really innovative things coming out of the right. Like, for example, the one I talk about all the time is having committee votes being posted online is something that Rep. Pete Sessions, I think is his name, introduced because I think it may be out of issues with the Rules Committee and them wanting to have control and to have accountability with how votes happened in the Rules Committee. He introduced this, and it's kind of ironic, it got referred to the Rules Committee, and that's where it is now, and it's probably never leaving there. I think there are a lot of innovative things coming out of the right also. And you can see this with the Sunlight Foundation too. We have a lot of alliances with groups on the left and a lot of different groups on the right, especially limited government groups or traditional conservative groups tend to view transparency as a virtue. So,
in our data, I think there's a real perception that the money politics issue is on the left, but if you look at the data and the way it's presented, it's clear that the phenomena cuts all the way across the political spectrum. There's a huge amount of union and money influence, and what happens, I think, is that it's the people who are actually taking this data and publicizing it, et cetera, that create that perception, and that as the as the users start being, more Republican bloggers, et cetera, start taking and looking at the influence of money in politics on their issues, that we'll be able to challenge that perception. I also just, while I'm speaking, I want to take the opportunity, because I missed it before, to point out that the Sunlight Foundation is a major. Our federal site wouldn't have been created without the Sunlight Foundation. They've been very important in instituting this change and making it possible. So I want to take the moment on that. I had one more point about this. I'll come back to it.
I guess I'll throw in that there's something like 8 bills, I think, proposed in Congress right now that address specifically the recommendations that the Open House Project has made and the kinds of stuff that we're talking about. And I think all but one are sponsored by Republicans, and it's like what John said, that I think they're trying to assert John thinks, and I guess I agree, that they're trying to assert their minorityness, but I guess there's a sad part that comes with it, that none of the bills will probably pass because the majority wants to be the ones that are going to come up with the bills that make the good changes that people like. So it's still kind of, to the extent that it might be a left issue at all, it still requires us to kind of, as citizens, to push the left to actually make some differences and pick up on the ideas that some of the right are already proposing and are putting through the motions.
I remember my other point, which is that people see the influence of money, for instance, or the correlation of money on the issues that they feel passionate about and concerned about. The things that are actually working for them through the legislative process, they tend to be blind to. And what we're interested in seeing is getting people to see it across the board, and whether or not that's an influence that that people should be aware that it's not just a pure political system that we're looking at, that there's this huge impact, and it's not souring, it's impacting the debate all the time. It's just that whatever legislation is being talked about, we should look at the money aspect of it and raise that awareness so that there's a general power relationship to that. People can see that they can actually engage before it's too late to have the impact become law. So.
Tim?
Can you talk a little bit about what sorts of grassroots activity these sorts of websites have, excuse me, have generated, or is that something you're still looking for in terms of large number of citizens? I mean, it's the Daily Kos is sort of an example of that. Of once the data is available, presumably you'll see grassroots lobbying and letters to Congress and so forth. Are there tools for that, and are people really taking up those sorts of activities based on this data?
We've had increasing, citations of the data and things that people are concerned about. The widgets have been picked up by a number of people. We're in a position of having to spoon feed a lot of organizations some of the information to show them how useful it is. And part of our challenge is that a lot of our potential audiences that will, once they start using it, they'll reach a whole new audience with this information, that they've already got their agendas and they've got their ways of presenting and talking about their issues. And this is adding on another aspect. And so we have to show them how it's actually useful for them to meet their means and meet their goals. Really, this is going to be the first Congress in which we've had all of the data lined up and ready to go, so that it's there as the vote happens. They can get the information out to their constituents. So we're tremendously excited. It's also, this political season, there's just a huge upsurge of engagement in general. So I think, all of these tools are going to take off in 2008.
There's another example of the Sunlight's work that's probably very relevant to your question. We have a series of projects called distributed research projects, and they're not something that I work on necessarily, but the idea is to find things where it takes a little bit of effort or something that's suitable for a citizen that might be passionate about something to do some research, add it into everybody else's, and then you come out with something interesting. So one of those that we did recently was Earmark Watch was the name of the website, and we took all of the earmarks from I think it was 2 appropriations bills where we had the data, put it onto a website where, easy to use interface, and let people say who gave the money, where's it going to, do they have a relationship with them, do they have family members that work there, basically rooting out why the money was spent that way. And those distributed research projects, they'll often have like 1,500 entries necessary to get completed, and we always end up putting them up on a Friday, maybe because the release is late or something, and they're always done within 2 days. So people tend to jump to attention very quickly. Another one we did was Where Are They Now? So all of the members of Congress that left, their employees were recently able to start becoming lobbyists. So we made a list of all the former staffers for members of Congress that have retired, and then gave you a link to look up on the Senate Office of Public Records, are they a lobbyist now or not? And so that gave us, within 2 days again, a comprehensive index of every former staff member and whether they've become a lobbyist or not. So those would be examples of sort of citizen engagement tools.
Chris?
I guess this is primarily to Josh, but maybe some of the others would like to comment on this. Some of the agencies are providing RDF files and data in accessible formats, but in many cases you're having to scrape it yourself. There was a news article late last year about the fairly, in my opinion, offensive use of robots.txt files by parts of the federal government to keep search engines out. I know that Thomas blocks most search, everything except Google. It specifically bans the non-Google bots. Mm-hmm. The worst of the offenders is actually the Director of National Intelligence, who blocks all search engines to all pages. And I'm wondering, I guess you guys aren't lawyers, but are you paying attention to the robots.txt files? Are you scraping in spite of them? And do you think that the federal government has any business using these files to keep us out?
So I can start with whether they have any business. I know that a serious concern that the team behind Thomas has is whether they have the resources to actually support all the people that they're trying to serve. And they're looking into creating RSS feeds and news services like that, but they're legitimately worried about whether this is going to overload their servers. And I can sort of speak from my angle that since through my site there are literally an infinite number of possible RSS feeds that could be generated, Google will start hitting them all, and it really kind of bums me out that a lot of my server processing time is going to Google. So even I try and kind of limit it like that. So I think they have a legitimate concern to actually create robot files in some cases. I don't ever check whether a robots file exists on any site that I scrape. I don't think it ever occurred to me to actually check. I just figured, it's my right or something. And I know that, what's his name? Carl Malamud of publicresource.org. I don't know where he came up with this, but he's been saying that any but
he wrote the Library of Congress and they said, you don't have to pay attention to robots.
Right. So just to repeat that, wait, who said which? That they
Carl Malamud wrote the Library of Congress and asked about robots.txt on government websites, and they wrote a memo back saying you should consider robots.txt as advisory, and you don't have to obey them.
So for the benefit of those following at home, we've just had the correct answer volunteered by Joe Hall in the back, who also has the next question, which is that Carl Malamud, I guess, asked the Library of Congress whether he had to follow the instructions contained in robots.txt files on government servers, and their basic answer was, no, you don't.
One other thing I'd just like to say on the searching or crawling issue from search engines is that there was the same Senate hearing that Josh talked about in the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee in the Senate. They had J.L. Needham from Google there testified about the sitemap protocol, and part of the new e-Government Act reauthorization that just passed is that at least the executive government is supposed to start implementing the sitemap protocol. And if you don't know what that is, it basically is a little file that you put on your site that says, if you're a search engine, this is how you search me. as a website, and that the effect of that is that federal websites should start showing up on Google. And this is a big problem because if you search for census statistics Ohio or something, you won't get, I don't know if this is true for the census, but as an example, very often when you search for government information on a search engine, it doesn't show up because they're not crawlable. But they're trying to address that with the sitemap protocol, which isn't, it's platform neutral or whatever you'd say. It works for every search engine. So that's trying to be addressed. I don't know about the Library of Congress, but.
I think, Joe, you're the next.
Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet that might want to ask?
That's a great meta question.
That's not my real question.
Anyone? I can put you next, whoever you are.
Okay.
Okay.
Speak now. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'll ask the question and then I'll ramble for a bit so you can think of an answer. My name is Joe Hall, UC Berkeley School of Information. So this is a question, as a funder you've probably asked, and as receiving funds you've probably been asked, which is a neat little thought experiment, which is, where do you see civics in the cloud in, say, 10 years? Now, and I want you to think about that seriously in the sense that what I mean by that is, what kind of services do you see in 10 years that are sort of the next thing after you get all the access you would like to make, MapLight the best it could be, or GovTrack the best it could be, or Sunlight, starts running out of ideas to fund or something like that. And then, and in a way to sort of prod you in that respect, think about, like, how do you imagine citizens, not even the geeky citizens, but other citizens interacting with data like this? What other things have you, once you been battling for a certain type of data and then you get it and then you start to see over the next horizon, can you think a couple horizons ahead and imagine things that might make citizen participation, even journalist participation, other things that maybe not even our Congress, like last night John had pointed out that there's something that looks to be like the old OTA that has been funded, and I didn't know about that, and it's the kind of thing I would expect to hear ringing from the balconies. But anyway, so that's my long-winded question.
Wow.
Anybody want to take that?
10 years.
10 years. Well, I could work backwards from 10 years, or maybe not 10, but 100 if we're not so lucky. So the end game is, I guess, the point where all this isn't really all that necessary, and the people running for Congress don't have their future careers as lobbyists in mind, and there's not as much money in the game, and all that. So I guess we want to put ourselves out of business. So then to go back a step, I think the information, so the tools are getting pretty mature in terms of what we're doing and getting information out there to the extent that the information is available. I think it has to make it more into mainstream awareness. So it would be nice if the mainstream media picked up on issues of, like, congressional transparency and how things could be better. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where I'd like to see things going, that our part would be complete, and then the media has to pick up on it and actually document it thoughtfully and tell the public why it's important. And then the step before that is, I guess, making the media better able to do these things. And so, maybe that's not public yet. Never mind. So there's sort of an onus on us to talk to the media, I guess, and try and bring them in a little bit.
I think one of the big shifts that's going to happen is that a much higher percentage of the population is going to be educating themselves through these tools and engaging them and be data native and have the expectations of openness and responsiveness of their government that previous generations just haven't had. We're going to have people who expect to have their insight on legislation be taken while have an opportunity to weigh in on stuff while legislation's being considered, and maybe having much more access to their own representative in bringing new ideas to Congress. And I think they'll, if things keep going this way, that there'll be much more responsiveness, and some of the stuff that's going on in Sunlight might be coming out of the representative's office.
I'd like to just follow on to Joe's question by quoting from the tech platform document that's been released by the Obama campaign. Not because I particularly have a horse in the race, I do not, but because I was startled by a piece of it and wanted to get your guys' reactions to it. One of the things that he says, in addition to support for open formats and stuff like that, toward the end of his campaign document on technology, it says that he supports, quote, pilot programs to open up government decision-making and involve the public in the work of agencies not simply by soliciting opinions, but by tapping into the vast and distributed expertise of the American citizenry to help government make more informed decisions. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but I understand that the people who helped write this document have thrown around at a very high conceptual level the idea of using tools like wikis and other online participatory infrastructure somehow in the government process. And I don't know whether that's the kind of thing that you guys foresee as part of your mandate or not, but I'm interested to find out.
Can I go negative before you go positive?
I think that's accurate.
Okay. I think there's a very limited role for wikis and things that the type of collaborative technology that we have today. I think will have a very limited role. So Joe will know from the Open Government Working Group that in trying to form 8 principles of what it means to be what it means for government data to be open. So this was like, I don't know, a 50-word short thing. 30 people could not do it in like 4 hours. Collaboration on sort of a very, let's see, fine-grained policy issue doesn't seem to really work well in the types of models that I think we have today. But I do think there's some role for expertise in the public to help. So.
I think Josh is right to be guarded about the way that you're optimistic about the future of collaboration in the public sphere, but I think there are a lot of good examples of it starting to be implemented. One of them is the Patent Office, which has a huge backlog in patents that they have to examine, recently instituted a public patent examination system where you can volunteer to help them find prior art. So before, and it's kind of a very well-designed system where you say, I am an expert on nanotechnology and portable memory or whatever, and then the people that are the most trusted researchers on that submit a bunch of research that then the best of that ends up getting passed on to the patent examiner. And this is kind of something that's being thought about across the government, although I agree that wikis are of limited usefulness. They're sometimes used in interagency or in different ways that help people, but I guess my main point is that collaboration in the future is going to be a lot different than what we think it is now, and it's going to take a lot of work to design things that have a big effect. Something I'd just like to point out is that we haven't really touched on mobile technology at all, but that's kind of an immense thing. I recently read that the Nokia 1100 has sold 200 million models or pieces or whatever. So this is like a lot of people in the third world, their single experience of technology is having a mobile phone, which kind of has a huge impact on your sense of self and your sense of being an agent. And so as that sort of technology just is distributed everywhere and the internet becomes widely available like it is here, people's voices and people's expertise becomes more available. Now, the design of being able to take advantage of that takes a lot of thought. But I think my point is that we don't know what it's going to look like, and it's going to take a lot of work to get there.
John, if I can just push you a little bit on that, talking about what's going on outside the United States. To what extent is the community of U.S. open government people involved in thinking about the rest of the world, and where does that seem to be headed?
Well, it's actually really exciting. There are a lot of great things happening in the rest of the world. Some really unlikely places have the best structured data. Stephen Clift works on e-democracy, and somebody might have to fact check me on this, but I believe he recently said that Mongolia has the most robust XML for their legislation out of any country that he's worked with. And there are a lot of really exciting things happening in the rest of the world. Somebody that works with the New Zealand government that I recently met when I was abroad has just designed spectacular tools working with My Society, which is a group from Great Britain that has done a lot of very simple tools like Hear from Your MP, or they made an e-petition site, which is just really simple. It's just create petitions. And it was mocked by whoever the Prime Minister was at the time, Tony Blair, mocked it. Or maybe it was Gordon Brown, I'm not sure which, but one of them mocked this e-petition site and said it's not going to have no impact. We're going to levy this tax on people that are commuting into the city. And then within the next 2 days, they had 14 million signers of the petition, and they had to withdraw the legislation after he mocked it. And that was actually the best thing that could have happened for their site. Since then, the government has bought it, and it's now the 10 Downing Street e-petition.
Only in the UK.
Yeah. So there are a lot of really exciting things that are happening that I think that they should inform each other. And so I guess that brings up another problem, though, with collaboration, is this sort of problem of having a standardized way of referring to things and standardizing reference. So if you want to refer to a bill, how do you do that? With a URI or with a URL or with RDF or whatever. How can you say this particular bill when that bill might be made up of 7 different versions as it moves throughout the legislative process? And then if you move beyond there, what if you want to do a search across the whole world for all of the Freedom of Information Acts that have happened since 1950 and apply to executive branch agencies? That's a search that should be able to happen, but I don't know how you would do that right now. But as references to legislative information become more standardized, that's something that we can look forward to doing.
Just one other, getting back to that, and another tangent is looking again at states and municipal areas, and there's a huge discrepancy between a few places that are presenting data really well and others that don't even collect the data, and let alone make it available to people to scrape a page. And they're also really, every state there are 11 states that have no commercial use prohibitions on data, which makes, creates a legal challenge to trying to use it and present it. And as you get more and more out into the grassroots, where arguably more people are ready to put their time and energy to engage because they see a more immediate impact of their engagement, there's less and less resources going towards opening up this information. So 10 years from now, some of these places might still be just putting up PDFs of their legislation.
Yeah.
Hope not.
So these sites are great. They are, I think, not quite as sophisticated as, say, Google or Yahoo. And it occurs to me that, for example, Google has Google.org, which is a nonprofit that does various charitable things. Do you know if they've made this a focus, or if there's been discussions with them? Because it seems like they should be able to, pull a few engineers over from Google and apply some of that same expertise and some of those resources to this sort of activity.
I think we may have people in the room who could speak to that with greater directness than anyone on the panel.
Yeah, we actually both just looked at each other and did one of these. So we probably get back to from people that are working on things in that area of that area.
I know there was a guy whose name was mentioned. J.L. Needham.
He works at Google. He attended the Open Government Working Group meeting in December. He was also on the panel, the Senate committee hearing that was mentioned twice. So his presence is indicative of Google's interest to some degree, but yeah.
As far as I know, this is third hand, but their focus is on as far as I know, their focus has been on getting government information to be accessible to search engines, and that was the main thrust of it. I can't speak to whatever else might be involved, though.
But there haven't been any official projects out of Silicon Valley.
They have a policy blog, a public policy blog, so that might be a good place to check.
Are there any other questions? Oh, here we go. Great.
Do you know about any trends in local governments or what we can do with regard to local governments?
What can be done? And I know some of the major cities, Los Angeles and New York, are really beginning to push this. The trend recently has been that, at the state level anyway, agencies that are doing a really good job at transparency work and accountability tend to see some of their, not across the board, but often get their funding cut. And they're often, when presenting the information, website information is often, it's hired out, and they change vendors and what have you, and it's not really done with an eye towards the public end user at the state level. There's just hasn't been that much attention to it. That being said, there's some states that do much better in terms of, like for California, that includes lobby information of the industries that support and oppose legislation right in the legislative record, which is really valuable information. No reason why that couldn't be done, in a lot of other areas. So it's I mean, there's no across the board answer. Some states are doing a fantastic job. Some have, not. Some cities are doing a great job.
One thing that's interesting to me about this panel as against the rest of the content of the workshop is that we're on a very practical bend here, which makes me personally happy as a citizen, since it's clear there's a lot of work to do. Andrew, you mentioned earlier the desire to have sentiment analysis that can tell you what kind of a position someone's taking with respect to a bill, so you know whether to code their dollars red or green with respect to some measure, which sounds like it might be an area for further academic study. And I wonder if I could ask each of you in turn to think about specifically whether or not there are things that we in the academy here could be doing in a sort of non-activist but perhaps more of a research context, that if we did do them might prove helpful to you in your efforts.
So, just to note on the sentiment analysis, there has been research on that. I know that there was one paper at CMU that actually tried to identify the positions of members of Congress on particular bills before votes had been taken, and it, I think, was successful to some degree. Yeah, I have some thoughts, but I'm not ready yet to. Someone else wants to.
I can say briefly something I didn't talk about with the Sunlight Foundation is that a very large component of our work is either doing web development or we're a grant-making organization. When we give grants, that comes along with the expertise of the Sunlight Labs, which is a very talented team of web developers and designers and data architects, and I don't even know what all their titles are. But there's a lot of technical expertise there, and that's something that I see in the developer community is sort of the need for a more closer-knit community. So as they're offering their resources and trying to make public, like there's a Sunlight Foundation API which you can call on and get different kinds of information from it. I'm not sure everything that it does, but I guess the first thing that comes to mind when you ask for where research could be done, I just think about how that community of developers might benefit from being closer linked and talking about what sort of things are available, because it seems like the development world, there are all these things happening sort of in not silos but off on their own, and then all of a sudden things launch and look a lot alike, and if they were connected before that it might have been more efficient. So
yeah, it's not really my part of our project, but I know because there's such a huge disparity between the way this data is presented and just things like how interest groups are coded and some of the nitty-gritties of how you look at the way the data comes from various resources, getting something that was across the board that could be a model that was taken on by everybody at the state level, local level, or whatever would it'd be a huge task to then get people to take that on, but having some standardization of things like the category codes and that sort of thing would have a sea change impact of being able to then use this data in a lot of different ways and link it up the way some of the ways Josh was telling about it.
So I think David's point is really important. I had been thinking that, and we were talking at dinner a little bit last night, that in some ways Congress isn't able to make use of expertise that exists in the public because they don't know how to get it, and maybe the expertise isn't volunteering themselves. I guess at the same time we need some expertise too, because we're kind of narrowly focused in one area, but the area is much larger. So, for instance, the issue of how money actually interacts with politics is a very, very difficult and complicated question to look at thoroughly in a deep academic sense. There are papers and papers about whether campaign contributions influence votes, actual roll call votes taken, and apparently the consensus is that really money doesn't affect votes if you look at the record, which is nice to know. One thing is right about Congress, I guess, but there's a lot of questions that MapLight raises that could be looked at in more detail. I've been trying to encourage two economics friends of mine to pick up on this issue, but they didn't. You need complicated statistical models, I think, to really look at the data carefully. And without doing complicated statistical models, things can be very superficial and maybe not so revealing as much as we want the numbers to be revealing. Then the second thing is that in some respects we might be good as programmers, but we don't have good sort of visualization experience. So I can collect a lot of data, but I'm not particularly good at making it visually appealing, except for some maps that you saw. I thought those were pretty cool. But so besides maps, I can't make charts very nicely that look very good and animated things, right? So I could use the help of like the MIT Media Lab or something like that to kind of help in terms of making the numbers clearer.
So maybe this is a good place to pause. The conversations can continue over lunch, which is served behind us, and the last panel of the day and of the workshop will convene at 1:30. Thanks.